Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to start out with a question and ask how many people actually collect their own physiological data? Raise your hand. Awesome, amazing. Now, how many people use physiological data from open data sets, and that's kind of where they get majority of their data? Okay, cool, that's great. I was going to say, even if you did get that kind of data, that this is still really important to know because it's really important to know where your data comes from and what could be in the data that was collected and you may not know. So I will, start with basically a practical guide, what it looks like to collect your data, what you should be looking out for, and how that, how we can best quality check the data, essentially. So disclosures, most of what I'll be talking about is what we have at Vanderbilt University, so I'll be discussing the BioPAC system a bit, as well as our Philips in-scanner system, so a little bit of bias there. And then also I'm a member of the Physiopy community, so there's some stuff that may be a little bit relevant to a toolbox there, and also just some of the documentation that we have. So this is the BioPAC setup. If you've worked with the BioPAC system, you may be familiar with how this looks. So typically what happens with the physiological toolbox equipment is there's multiple cartridges or software essentially or hardware for the different things that you are collecting. So here we actually have the respiratory one is the one on the very end here, a PPG. We do have the galvanic skin response and a couple other ones in there as well, EDAs, electro, something with the scan, I can't remember. That is not my area of expertise, but that is kind of what it would look like, and you'd be able to kind of plug and play with what you're interested in collecting in the scanner, as many of you probably know. I'll focus specifically today on talking about the respiratory belt and the PPG system. That is what we collect and the data that we use predominantly, so that's my most relevant area of expertise there. So this here is an example of the BioPAC respiratory belt. It's essentially a tube that will go through there, and it's a sensor that will respond to the abdominal or thoracic circumference. So as Meryl talked about, you can put it on your chest, you can put it on your abdomen. That is very dependent on a lot of different factors. For us, typically we find the best response essentially with the respiratory belt if it's right below or like right on top of the chest. It also really just is dependent on the person that you're scanning and what they're comfortable with. But I really recommend that you test this out. So a lot of times what we'll do, especially if we have somebody that we're maybe not getting a good reading on, is we'll put it on them while they're outside of the scanner, start our system, check the signal a little bit, and then make sure that we're seeing the responses that we want to see before we actually send them back. There's different ways that these belts can capture the respiratory changes, like Meryl said, so I won't go into that in too much detail, but typically it's either a pressure change or the stretch sensors. Okay, let's see, this video should hopefully play. Yeah, so one of the people in Physiopy made these wonderful videos last year, so I basically just highlighted them here. She has kind of a system that she could take back and actually test this out on herself with, whereas ours is pretty much like stuck in the scanner, so it was hard for me to do as easily. But you can see on the top panel of the video that she has actually the respiratory belt on her. So right now she's talking, so it looks a little bit funky. But once she stops talking and she adjusts basically the scale so you can see a really nice respiratory waveform, then you'll start to see basically these sinusoidal peaks start to come out and flow. And that is what the respiratory data should look like. So here on the side, you kind of see at the very top, this is something that I collected on our BioPAC system, is a respiratory data signal that looks pretty normal. On the bottom, those two down there, one of them is if I have a loose belt, one of them is if I take deep breaths. So essentially you can kind of get a picture of what might be happening while the belt is around your waist and what it might be doing. So typically if you have a loose belt, you're gonna see a really diluted signal, essentially. It's not gonna be able to pick it up as easily as well. If the belt is too tight, a lot of times you'll start to see that clipping that Meryl talked about. So essentially you're not capturing your full peak, your full sinusoid. So it's really important to just kind of make sure you're looking at this data as you're collecting, while you're quality checking it later on, to make sure that what you're gonna end up taking from the data for fMRI use or whatever it is gonna be actually useful. Yes, and then this is just another figure that shows kind of a normal versus a loose belt versus a really tight belt. And then the second thing I'll talk about is the PPG. So this is an example, again, of the BioPAC system's PPG. This is gonna measure your changes in capillary blood volume, and it's observing your arterial pulse waveform. Hemoglobin typically reflects off the infrared light sensor that's in that little black wrap that you see, and there's an optical sensor in there that basically is able to look at the different kind of hemoglobin. And what we do with this sensor is we wrap it around the finger. You can see there, one thing I want to point out, if you use the BioPack system, we haven't had this PPG sensor for very long, and you can already see that it's kind of like falling apart a bit. So it's really important to make sure that if you're wrapping the PPG around the finger, that it is actually on the finger and it's not going to fall off. So here again, we have a video by Mary Medema in Montreal, and this is her with the PPG system on. And here she's highlighting, that's a very good PPG peak. You can see the systolic peak on that first part. Oh, yeah, okay. And then the diachrotic notch, and then the diastolic peak. So that's a very good example of what you're hoping to capture when you're looking at your PPG data. And so I believe it keeps going, yeah. So here she's just showing exactly, pretty much like she's has the PPG system on. I know she's moving her hand a bit during this part, and then she'll start moving her finger, and you'll kind of see how that reflects in the data. Here's the finger. So yeah, you can see the hand movement is like kind of, it doesn't look too terrible, but as soon as she starts to move that finger or twitch that finger, then you see a lot of movement and kind of transient noise happen in the data. And so same thing with the respiratory belt. The really important things to make sure are it's not too tight, it's not too loose. The data that you're getting is good quality. So on the top picture there, that's part of like the BioPack setup and calibration sheet. Essentially, if you have a loose sensor, you're not going to be able to see very defined waveforms, and that is a big issue, especially because with PPG specifically, you're really interested in those peaks. With a loose or a tight sensor, you're going to see a really diluted signal again. It's not going to be able to capture that change as well either, and so you really want to be able to see these nice, the nice waveforms, and you should be looking for that. This picture down in the bottom right is basically a transient noise, a finger movement in a static form. And essentially what you notice there is that there's just this extra peak or this noise within the signal that is very common and you do have to deal with when you are doing some post-processing. Okay, so these are other parts of the setup. So again, I talked about the PPG and respiratory transducer setups, and then we have the patch for going into the scan room. Typically you have all these wires going in there. One of the key things with a lot of physiological data collection is how the wires are threaded through the MR patch and into the scanner. As you can see, that clear, well maybe you can see hopefully, the clear cord is the respiratory belt cord. That is how basically you're measuring the changes in pressure. If there's loops or if there's notches or if anything is messed up with those cords, you're gonna have very different readings than what you would like to see. So making sure that somehow, however crazy it might look like, you do have very continuous and like clean cord wrapping and coiling and all that stuff is very important in terms of the quality of the data. And then lastly, one of the things that you do want to do with physiological data is collect MR triggers. So there's typically a little trigger box that connects to the scanner and then to the physiological data equipment. And this basically allows you to sync the data collection with your MR, with the MRI and the TRs that are basically happening, so that you can then take the physiological data within the TR around the image that you're acquiring and use that for whatever you need to use. This is a kind of blurry example of what the acquisition platform looks like for at least BioPack. You can see on the top panel the triggers that are appearing, a semi-noisy PPG signal, and then the start of a respiratory signal. So this is kind of what a setup might look like and something that you would kind of keep track of as you're watching or going through your data. The importance of collecting MR triggers, many of you probably know this, but it allows you to synchronize your physiological data with the MR for identifying noise, removal of the noise, and anything that might be influencing the actual neural components that we're trying to capture. It also helps us improve the quality and accuracy of our fMRI data. And if you're interested in using the physiological measures as covariates, like many of us are, it's a really good way to make sure that everything is continuous and synchronized across the entire scan. And they usually appear like this. So basically when you're collecting the data, every time that the MRTR occurs, there's gonna be a little pulse. Sometimes people do not have the trigger set up, or you get physiological data that is not synced to the scanner. What should you do in that case? It can be pretty tricky, but there are a couple options to try and align the data. The first one is manual alignment. So if you have the exact start and end times of both the MR and the physiological data, you can kind of like makeshift that. But if you do not know those exact times, then it's kind of difficult to do. Yes, and then if you are doing a task or you have some kind of like key feature within the data, you could potentially align it with the physiological data and the MRI data as well. And then lastly, you could do some kind of cross-correlation, see if you can find a potential lag shift that maximizes that. There's a couple other ways as well, but those are just some options. But it is possible, it's just a little bit more tricky. So if you've collected your physiological data, many of you have probably looked at it in some format. Here's just an example. Now what do you do with that? So as I mentioned, we do have the Philips in-scanner data collection, which looks like this scan log that you see. Basically, from the MR machine, when you download your data, a scan log is outputted. It's in this kind of file format. You have a bunch of different columns of your data. And then if you use BioPack, you can output it into different acquisition files, CSV files, MAT files, depending on what you're using. The nice part about, for instance, a MAT file here is you have a little bit more information. You can tell what the channels actually are, the units that were collected, the labels, but it's also more useful to use it in a CSV format, but there's just really no header format with, when you are outputting a CSV. But if you know the setup of your acquisition, then you know that first channel would be the trigger, the second channel would be PPG, the third channel would be your respiratory. So this is kind of an example, again, just the raw data of what comes out of that file. You have the trigger information on the top, the PPG in the second column or second row, and the respiration on the third. This is raw data. One of the issues, and actually the reason I put this up here is with our Philips scanner at least, we have a lot of issues in the respiration belt and we constantly get these dropouts, as you can kind of see. So even though we might be doing everything we hope to be doing right, we're still gonna get things that we cannot fix or account for. And so that's kind of a huge caveat with collecting physiological data. When you have the physiological data, you can typically process this data. One of the first things you can do is, with the cardiac data, is bandpass filter and then apply some kind of peak detection. So essentially in the cardiac data, you're wanting to find all of these peaks within the signal, and that is gonna be really important for anything you're gonna do moving forward with denoising or using it in some kind of manner. From that data, you can capture the cardiac rate, which Meryl talked about a bit, basically looking at the peak locations across the MR in the scanner. And then you can look at the interbeat interval, which is essentially the derivative of those peak locations, and figure out essentially this, what the information is between beats. Artifacts and noise that you might see in this data when you're looking at it post hoc is any kind of baseline drifts. There's some high frequency noise that appears. Transient noise like the finger movement is very common. You can actually see here in this data the kind of outlier peaks that are there. Most likely are some kind of twitch or finger movement, and there are quite a few at certain times. So how do we address those and what can we do? There's a couple different options. One's just manual removal of the data, so making sure that you are aligning the before and after peaks, or before and after fluctuations to make sure there's really no like misalignment, I guess, when you're taking those together. The other thing you could do is interpolation. That's pretty commonly what we do, or some kind of despiking, which basically you're taking the information of the sinusoid or the waveform before and after and applying some like linear interpolation or a little bit more complex to remove that and kind of try to smooth it out to the rest of your data. You could also do some kind of IC or deconvolution. Again, there's a lot of different ways to do it, really no right way to do it, as long as you are addressing these artifacts in a way that keeps it as biological as it can be. Steph will talk about this a little bit more later, but I kind of wanted to introduce these low frequency signals and what that might mean. So when you're interested in removing the noise component from fMRI data, a lot of that is due to the peaks or the phase of the signal at the high frequency level, but at the low frequency level, there are some really great regressors that you can use in your fMRI data to actually look at bold signal or neural signal that might have physiological correlations. And so one of the things that we do here is look at heart rate variability, pulse ox amplitude. These are just some ways to capture that here and what those might look like in the time course form. Heart rate is essentially the beats per minute. Heart rate variability, we just do the root mean, the RMSSD. And then the pulse ox amplitude is essentially the standard deviation of that signal across the entire time course. And then with the respiratory data, we also just do a typical respiratory variation and capture the standard deviation, but there's many ways you can do this as well. And as you can see here, in this respiratory variation from the Philips scanner, we have these dead spots within the signal. Ways that we can capture that or work with that is essentially to make those a zero value, interpolate over them. There's many different things, and it's difficult to decide, but it's kind of one of those areas that's open for a lot of discussion. A really good reason to join like communities and talks and groups like this where you can have people give ideas on what you could do with that or make better assumptions. So the takeaways hopefully that you got from this talk is more on the technical side, but is still important nonetheless, because a lot of times I feel like a lot of these key aspects of actually collecting the data and processing and cleaning the data are kind of brushed aside, or you have a pipeline and it's easy to not really go back and see what's in the data. So hopefully you have a better understanding of what goes into collecting good quality respiratory and cardiac signal. If you've ever had bad cardiac or respiratory signal, now you might have an idea of what to go back and look for. And then also an improved ability to kind of assess the quality of your data. So maybe looking at these signals and going back and looking at your own signals, you have an idea of how to fix or process or clean them a bit better. So like I mentioned, I am a member of Physiopy. We basically are an international group. There's many of us all over the place. And we try to have these monthly discussions and basically discussions on best practices of collecting physiological data. How do you acquire your data? We use different kinds of equipment, so BioPack, 80 instruments, pretty much every single one that you can think of, we probably have somebody that uses it as well. We also are working on putting together community practices for collecting physiological data. So we just released our first version of that. It's basically like what we intend to be a best practices if you are collecting physiological data. And we would love to have people join, provide information, discussions, feedback on this as well. There's also some toolboxes there. For instance, if you use BIDS for fMRI, there's a way to convert your phys to BIDS, your physiological data in the BIDS format. And then we also are building a quality checking toolbox. So basically, the hope there is you can collect physiological data, run it through this toolbox, and get a lot of information about the quality and the interpretability of your signals. So that is it. And I want to thank everybody for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Sarah. There's a question online that I want to ask you. Are there any tools that segment physiological data automatically so that one doesn't have to restart, stop and restarting the acquisition of data for every run?
While collecting the data, is that?
I assume while collecting the data?
To my knowledge, no. Typically in that situation, if we have an acquisition and, like for instance, we really do value the physiological data that we collect. If we're only about 5 to 10 minutes in and we collect about 20-minute scans, we actually will stop and start over. It's really difficult to kind of retrospectively fix big chunks of missing physio data or any issues with that. From my experience, you have an easier time if it's a smaller transient noise or if it's smaller noise segments in general, but if there's really big chunks of physio data missing in your signals, there's really not a whole lot you can do with that, especially if you want the whole continuous signal. So not yet, but it would be a great tool. I know there's a lot more real-time fMRI stuff coming out, so maybe there'll be some real-time physio fixes and interpolations in the future, but.
And I assume if the question was, so if your question is, if you can just come on this side of the room, that's fantastic. If the question was just like in terms of stopping and restarting for instance, BioPack acquisition, that's phys to BIDS. So you can just acquire everything and then phys to BIDS will split it for you.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's something that you can do. There's another question online, but first if you want to.
Thank you. So I asked the last year, but maybe something changed, so I wanted to update my question. What about the pupillometry? Is there anything going on in the community or any efforts on that front?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, yes and no. Not exactly in Physiopy, but there are people within Physiopy that use pupillometry data. For instance, we actually do. We are just about to start acquiring physiologic or pupillometry data, but I've used a lot of data sets that have it already collected and have processed it a lot in that term. Do you have like a specific question on that? Or are you thinking more of like best like community practices for people that are interested in that?
Yeah, so we did acquired some pupillometry data with some psychiatric patients during fMRI tasks, and it's been really difficult to get any data like sense from it, even pre-process actually. So that's why I'm just asking, because maybe one day there will be some tools and insights.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to chat offline. I've been going through, I don't know if anybody's worked with the HCP aging pupillometry data, but I've been going through that, and it's been very difficult as well. My best bet with that has been making contrast images and then tracking over time, and looking at the height essentially to find like some kind of percent eye closure metric, but I'm happy to chat more about different things later. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. I was curious about the respiration transducer that you were using from the BioPack. How linear is that response? The reason I ask for that is they have an earlier version that they used to sell, which was more like this piezoelectric crystal, I think it's TSD201 or something, that was highly nonlinear. That is, if you take a double the deep breath, you barely see a blip increase in the change. So I'm curious with this device that you were using, how linear that was.
That's a great question. I haven't looked directly at the linearity, but it is a lot more intuitive than the old one, because we actually do have the old one, and I do think, like, we do see better changes and better captures of different levels of breaths, or like a double deep breath, or those kinds of things. So I haven't directly measured that, but I would guess the linearity is much better.
Right, and I would expect it too, because we use the GE belt, which is also a pneumatic version, and it is highly linear. So
that's how the Philips belt is, and same, yeah.
Just to be clear, BioPack does not sponsor this session.
No, it's my bias is we have that.
There's another 2 questions on the app. I don't know if there's anything else in the room. Otherwise, I will start on the app. And by the way, you can ask questions on the app. Log into ohbm.cnf.io on any browser or through the OHBM app itself. Is there work in the pipeline of BioPack development to detect error or bad quality physiological data live while the collecting is ongoing with fMRI scans? Post-hoc cleaning has its limitation and the quality is bad at the raw data.
To my knowledge, no. Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. They might be working on something. I have no idea, but to my knowledge, there isn't really anything. Again, the best thing we do is if we see really bad, either loss of signal or whatever it is, we typically do actually just restart the scan over, which is just why it's very important to be watching your physiological data as you are collecting, because if you are very interested in that signal, it needs to be acquired correctly and accurately. So we typically have a grad student or somebody actually watching the computer for loss of signal. So. Any other questions?
And another question? Yeah, it's full of questions for yourself. What are the difference in acquiring and processing cardiac signals between PPG and ECG?
I am going to defer you actually to our community guidelines from Physiopy, because there is a member that has a huge few paragraphs on exactly why you should look at PPG or ECG and what each one brings to the table. I have not worked with ECG enough to really know the difference between those two. I've mostly worked with PPG, but there is actually a 2 or 3 paragraphs in there that is about that exact question. So if you go to the community guidelines for Physiopy, you'll find that in there. And she did a really great job of explaining that. I just can't remember it off the top of my head. So.
Any other question from the room? If not, I have a question for you. So we do a lot of quality checks after we acquire the data for any different reason. But is there any strategy that we can use exactly just when we put the subject in the scanner just to check if our physiological data collection is working?
Yes, yeah, so that's one thing that we do. Again, it just kind of requires an extra checkpoint or more time, but we will typically, as was mentioned before, putting the respiratory belt on the PPG system, those kinds of things, when they're lying in the scanner, there's typically that period before they're sent back into the scanner where you can turn on your system or check really quickly. With the in-scanner systems, it's more difficult to do that. A lot of times those kind of pop on when the scan is actually in session. But if you have a third-party physiological data equipment, you can absolutely test that beforehand. And so a lot of times what we will do is we'll make sure that everything looks good, the signals are appearing, they look pretty good for what we're looking for, and then we'll send them back. That's what we typically do. Making sure like the belt, like was said before, isn't too tight or isn't too loose. The PPG is on the finger well. If it's loose or if you're worried it's going to come off, extra tape is always a good thing to use. But yeah, it's really just like making sure you are checking the data quality before they go back in, and it's a lot harder to pull them out and restart them than it is to just make sure it's good from the get-go.
And what about post-hoc? So after the acquisition, what would be the main things that you're looking for to say if the data is good or bad?
Yes, post-hoc, if you are looking at the data after you've collected it, making sure that you do see the like really nice waveforms in the PPG signal, you do see really good peaks. Respiratory-wise, you're just, again, looking for kind of those sinusoid signals. Any kind of, or like I had, I don't know if I can go back. I don't know if I'll go back. But basically, you're looking for just really continuous smooth data. And if there's any kind of crazy artifact or like high frequency noise or spike or whatever it is, that's pretty easy to assume that there was something going wrong there. But is that what you're kind of asking? Like, okay. I would say if there's more specifics, I can get into that. But
Final question from the app. Any tips on what to look out for in specific population, like elderly, obese, children, etc., etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. That also comes back to trying stuff out. A lot of times if we have a patient population, or sometimes you put a belt on like you typically would, but the signal doesn't look very strong, they might need to be a little tighter just to get a better idea of the respiratory variation. If you're not getting a good PPG signal, you can try switching the finger. Maybe there's not good circulation in one, the earlobe, the toe. Like there's many different ways to like try to do better by your signal. And so I would say just really doing those quality checks and making sure that before they go in, you're seeing good signal. So that's like tightening the belt, loosening the belt, messing with the PPG. That can definitely play a big role in patient population. So it's always good to check those too. But
sounds good. Thank you very much, Sarah. Is there any other final question? Oh, there is one. How do you manage MRI synced trigger with Biopack?
So I'm going to interpret what you mean by manage. So we have the MR trigger box, which is basically that. It's a tiny little box that you can purchase from Biopack specifically, and it plugs into wherever you have your trigger output from your MR. So like typically it is, I'm sure it's very site dependent. For us, it's like kind of, it comes off of like, in kind of like the closet area, I guess. I don't know exactly, but it's essentially this out panel, and like wherever you have your MRI hardware, like not just the scanner, but the actual hardware system, there's gonna be some kind of like panel that you can like, there's an in, there's an out, and there's certain things. I can explain it more in detail because my knowledge of the actual behind the scenes stuff is not great in terms of words, but I can try to describe it and better show you things. But basically there's this way that you can like plug in a wire, and then the trigger will come out of the MR, and then you can put that into the Biopack system, into their channel options in the front, and then immediately it will actually start collecting that. So you can, if you were just to put this in your computer and open a note file, if you put in this trigger cord, it would actually just start putting like a number every time the TR happens. So it's a very self-intuitive process. The Biopack system just has a really nice way of showing it, but you can actually just make a text file and have it input into your laptop, and then it'll just like flash a number every time a TR is collected. So yeah, that's not a very technical way to explain that, but if you have more questions, you can come find me.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Yeah.